The hotel room that changes every night. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of old wood and wax polish, as dusk settled over the small town of Ashwood, Vermont, nestled in the Green Mountains. At 6:17 p.m., the sky was a deep indigo, the last light fading over the rolling hills, casting shadows across the narrow streets. Emily Carter, 31, a travel writer with a restless spirit, checked into the Ashwood Inn, a quaint century-old building with ivy-covered walls and creaking floors. Her friend, Lucas Bennett, 33, a photographer with a knack for capturing the eerie, carried her bags, his camera slung around his neck. They were joined by Mia Harper, 29, a local historian with a love for old stories, who'd recommended the inn for its charm and its secrets. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Ashwood was quiet, its population small, its streets lined with colonial homes and gaslit lamps. The inn stood at the edge of town, its windows glowing softly, its signs swaying in the gentle breeze. Locals whispered of its history guests who vanished, rooms that weren't on the blueprints, strange sounds in the night. Emily, always chasing a story, booked room 13, despite the clerk's hesitation, her eyes darting away as she handed over the key. At 6:42 p.m., the trio climbed the narrow staircase, the air growing colder, the walls lined with faded portraits, their eyes seeming to follow. Room 13 was small, its decor a mix of antique charm and subtle decay, a four-poster bed, a chipped dresser, a single window overlooking the forest. The air was stale, the scent of dust mingling with something faint like old flowers or rust. Emily set her notebook on the dresser, her pen tapping restlessly, while Lucas adjusted his camera, snapping shots of the room, the lens catching odd shadows in the corners. Mia lingered by the door, her hands in her pockets, her voice low. "This place feels wrong," she said, her eyes scanning the walls, where the wallpaper seemed to shift, its floral pattern twisting slightly. At 7:09 p.m., they went downstairs for dinner. The dining room warm, filled with the clink of silverware and the murmur of other guests. The innkeeper, a wiry man with tired eyes, served them soup, his hands shaking as he avoided questions about room 13. Emily pressed, her voice curious, teasing. "Any ghost stories?" she asked, but he only smiled, tight-lipped, and walked away. The air grew heavier, the chandelier flickering, casting jagged shadows across the table. Lucas's camera clicked, capturing the room, but later, at 7:48 p.m., he frowned at the screen, his voice low. "The photos, they're blurry, like something moved." Back in room 13 at 8:14 p.m., the room was different. The bed was made, but the blanket was a different color, red, not blue. The dresser was against the opposite wall, its mirror cracked, though it hadn't been before. Emily's notebook was open, a page filled with handwriting she didn't recognize, scrawled words, "Stay." "See." Her heart quickened, her hands trembling as she showed Lucas and Mia, their faces pale in the dim light. The air was colder, the scent of rust stronger, and a low hum began, faint like a distant chant, vibrating through the floor. "This isn't right," Mia whispered, her voice shaking, her eyes darting to the window, where the forest seemed closer, the pines pressing against the glass. Lucas checked the door, his hands steady, but his breath uneven. It was locked, though they hadn't touched it. At 8:29 p.m., the hum grew louder, pulsing in their ears, the walls creaking as if the room was breathing. Emily's flashlight flickered, its beam catching the mirror, where a reflection moved a figure, tall, thin, its face blurred, standing behind them. She spun around, her breath catching, but the room was empty, the hum deafening, urging them to stay, to look. At 8:47 p.m., the lights went out, plunging the room into darkness. The hum, a chorus now, weaving through the air, their bones. Lucas's camera flashed, the sudden light revealing the walls now bare, the wallpaper gone, replaced by smooth, cold stone etched with symbols that seemed to writhe. Mia grabbed Emily's arm, her voice breaking. "We need to leave," she said, her words sharp, desperate. They pounded on the door, the wood unyielding, the knob cold like ice. The hum was inside them, pulling at their thoughts, their fears, whispering their names. At 9:03 p.m., The door opened, revealing a hallway that wasn't there before long, narrow, its walls lined with doors, each marked with a number that didn't exist. 13A, 13B, 13C. The air was thick, the scent of rust and flowers overwhelming, the hum louder coming from everywhere. Emily clutched her notebook, the strange handwriting now covering every page, words like stay, no, forever. Lucas's camera kept flashing, each photo showing the same figure, closer, its face a void, its eyes glinting. Mia led the way, her flashlight shaking, the beam catching shadows that moved too fast, too wrong. At 9:21 p.m., they reached a staircase descending into darkness. The steps uneven, the air colder, heavier, like water pressing against their lungs. The hum was a scream now, filling their heads, their chests, urging them to turn back, to stay. Emily's flashlight died, Mia's beam the only light, weak, flickering. The walls were stone, slick with moisture, etched with more symbols, pulsing faintly, glowing green. Lucas stopped, his camera shaking, his voice low. "It's following us," he said, his eyes wide, fixed on the darkness behind them. At 9:38 p.m., they found another door, heavy, iron, its surface cold, marked with the same symbols. It opened with a groan, revealing room 13 again. But different, the bed was gone, the dresser now a table covered with objects, a watch, a locket, a child's toy, none of which belonged to them. The mirror was whole, but it showed the figure standing in the room, its form clearer, its face still a void. The hum was deafening, the air thick with the smell of blood. The walls closing in, the symbols glowing brighter, urging them to touch, to stay. Emily dropped her notebook, its pages scattering, the handwriting now her own, though she hadn't written it. Mia screamed, her flashlight falling, the beam spinning across the floor, catching glimpses of more figures, circling, watching. Lucas grabbed the door, pulling it open, but it led to another hallway, endless, identical, the hum a roar, the air choking. At 10:02 p.m., they ran, the hallway twisting, the doors blurring past, each one opening to room 13. Always different, always wrong, new furniture, new objects, new shadows. At 10:19 p.m., they found a window, impossibly high, overlooking Ashwood, but the town was wrong empty, its streets twisted, its lights dim. The hum was softer now, coaxing, promising answers if they stayed. Emily's hands trembled, her eyes fixed on the mirror, where the figure was closer, its hand reaching, its breath cold against her neck. Lucas smashed the window with the chair, the glass shattering, the air rushing in, clean, cold, real. They climbed out, falling onto the grass, the inn behind them, its windows dark, its door closed. At 10:47 p.m., they stumbled into Ashwood, the town quiet, the streets normal, the inn unchanged, its sign still swaying. They called the police from a gas station, their voices shaking, their hands cold. At 11:14 p.m., officers searched room 13, finding nothing, no symbols, no objects, just a bed, a dresser, a mirror, all as it should be. The innkeeper swore no one had stayed in room 13 that night, his eyes avoiding theirs, his hands trembling. Clara's notebook was gone, Lucas's photos blank, Mia's flashlight dead. Ashwood whispered of the inn, of guests who saw rooms that weren't there, of nights that changed, of figures that followed. Emily stopped traveling, her stories unwritten, her dreams haunted by mirrors and hums. Lucas's camera stayed locked away, his photos empty, his sleep broken by shadows. Mia left Elkwood, her research abandoned, her nights filled with the sound of doors opening, closing. At 6:17 p.m., every evening, the air grew heavy, the hum returned, and the Ashwood Inn stood waiting, its rooms changing, its shadows watching, forever shifting, forever calling. The man who slept for 15 years and never aged. The evening was quiet, the air cool and heavy with the scent of cedar and damp earth, as dusk settled over the small town of Elkwood, Oregon, nestled deep in the Siuslaw National Forest. At 6:47 p.m., the sky glowed a soft orange, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the winding streets. Clara Bennett, 32, a librarian with a love for old folklore, walked home from the Elkwood Public Library, her scarf fluttering in the gentle breeze. Her brother, Nathan Bennett, 35, a carpenter with a steady hand and a quiet demeanor, waited on her porch, his truck parked in the driveway. Their friend, Lily Harper, 30, a park ranger with a sharp eye for detail, joined them, her boots still dusted with forest soil. They were meeting to plan a weekend hike, a ritual in a town where the forest was both a playground and a mystery. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Elkwood was small, its population barely 1,000, its houses old and weathered, their porches creaking under the weight of time. The forest loomed close, its pines dense, its trails whispering tales of lost travelers and strange lights. At 7:12 p.m., the trio sat in Clara's living room, the lamplight warm, the air filled with the scent of coffee and old books. Clara spread a map across the table, her fingers tracing a trail to Blackthorn Ridge, a remote spot rarely visited, known for its eerie silence and an old cabin, abandoned since anyone could remember. Nathan sipped his coffee, his eyes narrowing. "You sure about that place?" he asked, his voice low, cautious. Lily nodded, her smile tight. "It's just a hike," she said, but her fingers tapped restlessly on the table. The conversation turned to local legends, the kind Clara collected in her notebooks. She mentioned Elias Reed, a name whispered in Elkwood, a man who'd lived in the cabin on Blackthorn Ridge decades ago. The story was strange. Elias, a reclusive carpenter, went to sleep one night and didn't wake for 15 years. Yet, when he emerged, he hadn't aged a day, his face untouched by time, his eyes distant. Wrong. Townsfolk said he vanished soon after, the cabin left empty, its door never locked. Lily laughed, her voice sharp, forced. "Sounds like a ghost story," she said. But Clara's eyes lingered on the map, a chill creeping up her spine. At 7:38 p.m., they decided to visit the cabin, curiosity outweighing unease. The air outside was colder now, the stars hidden by clouds, the forest a wall of shadows. They drove Nathan's truck, the road to Blackthorn Ridge narrow, gravel crunching under the tires. At 8:14 p.m., they parked at the trailhead, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, the pines swaying in a wind that carried a faint hum like a distant chant, barely audible. The trail was overgrown, roots snaking across the path, the air thick with the smell of moss and something older, like stone, left untouched. By 8:42 p.m., they reached the cabin, a sagging structure of weathered logs, its windows boarded, its door ajar, creaking softly. The hum was louder here, vibrating through the ground, the air, their bones. Clara's flashlight flickered, its beam weak, catching glimpses of the cabin's interior dusty floorboards. A single chair, a bed with a tattered blanket. Nathan stepped inside, his boots heavy, his breath visible in the cold. "This place is wrong," he muttered, his voice low, tense. Lily stayed near the door, her flashlight sweeping the trees, her eyes wide. "Something's watching," she whispered, her voice barely audible. At 9:03 p.m., Clara found a journal on the bed, its leather cover cracked, its pages yellowed but intact. She opened it, her hands trembling, the hum pulsing in her ears. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, Elias Reed's name scrawled on the first page. Entries detailed his life, carving wood, tending the forest, then grew strange. "The hum comes at night, it knows my name. I can't wake up." The final entry, dated long ago, read, "I'm asleep, but I see. It's waiting." Clara's breath caught, her fingers cold, the journal heavy in her hands. The hum grew louder, a chorus now, weaving through the cabin, the air thick with the smell of earth and something metallic, like blood. Nathan's flashlight died, plunging them into near darkness, Lily's beam the only light, shaking across the walls. Shadows moved, fleeting, wrong, their shapes too tall, too thin, circling the cabin. Clara clutched the journal, her voice trembling. "We need to leave," she said, her words sharp, urgent. Nathan nodded, his jaw tight, but as they turned, the door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot. At 9:27 p.m., the cabin shook, the hum deafening, the walls creaking as if alive. Lily pounded on the door, her fists raw, her voice breaking. "It's locked!" she shouted, her eyes wide with panic. Nathan threw his shoulder against it, the wood unyielding, the air colder, heavier, pressing against their chests. Clara's flashlight caught something, a figure, standing in the corner, tall, still, its face hidden in shadow. The hum was in their heads now, whispering, urging them to stay, to sleep. Clara's knees buckled, the journal slipping from her hands, pages scattering across the floor. At 9:46 p.m., the figure moved, its steps silent, its form blurring like smoke given shape. Lily screamed, her flashlight dropping, the beam spinning across the room, catching glimpses of eyes too many, glinting, watching. Nathan grabbed a chair, swinging it at the door, the wood splintering but holding. The hum was a scream now, filling their minds, their bones, pulling at their thoughts. Clara saw flashes Elias Reed, asleep on the bed, his face young, untouched, his eyes open, staring at nothing. The figure was closer, its breath cold, its presence heavy, ancient, hungry. At 10:03 p.m., the door gave way, splintering under Nathan's final push. They ran, the forest fighting them, branches snagging their clothes, roots tripping their feet. The hum followed, relentless, weaving through the pines, carrying whispers of their names, of Elias's name. Clara clutched the journal, her hands shaking, her lungs burning. Lily's flashlight flickered, the beam catching shadows that moved too fast, too close. At 10:19 p.m., they reached the truck, collapsing inside, the engine roaring as Nathan floored it, the cabin shrinking in the rear view, its door still open, the hum fading, but never gone. At 10:47 p.m., they were back in Elkwood, the town quiet, the streets empty, the pines looming in the distance. Clara's hands trembled as she opened the journal again, its pages now blank, the words gone, as if they'd never been. Lily's eyes were wide, her breath uneven, her voice a whisper. What was that? She asked, but no one answered, the hum still echoing in their ears, faint but there. Nathan drove to the police station, his knuckles white, his face pale, the journal on the seat beside him, heavy, wrong. At 11:12 p.m., they told their story to Officer Daniels, a grizzled man with tired eyes, his notebook open, his pen scratching. The police searched the cabin at 11:49 p.m., finding nothing. No journal, no bed, no chair, just dust and silence. The hum was gone, the air still, but the officers' flashlights caught marks on the floor, faint scratches, like something had been dragged, then erased. Clara showed them the journal, its pages still blank, but Daniels's face hardened, his voice low. Elias Reed's been gone for years, he said, his eyes searching hers. No one's seen him, not since he woke up. Elkwood whispered of the cabin, of Elias Reed, of people who went to Blackthorn Ridge and came back, changed, if they came back at all. Clara burned the journal, its pages curling in the fire, but the hum lingered, faint, in her dreams. Nathan stopped hiking, his tools untouched, his eyes always on the forest. Lily left town, her ranger badge abandoned, her sleep haunted by shadows that didn't age. At 6:47 p.m., every evening, the air grew heavy, the hum returned, and the pines of Siuslaw seemed to watch, waiting for someone else to sleep, to never wake, to never age. She killed her victims on camera, the disturbing files of Aileen Wuornos. The humid air of central Florida hung heavy and thick over the dense sawgrass along the interstate highway. A patrolman stepped carefully through the muddy brush to examine the gray sedan that was abandoned near the woods. The vehicle had been sitting on the shoulder of the road for 2 days before anyone called it in. The year was 1989, and the stretch of highway was known for its isolation and long shadows. Detective Kalin arrived at the scene shortly after the patrolman discovered what was hidden in the tall grass nearby. A man's body lay face down in the dirt, and he was covered by a few discarded carpet squares. The detective swatted away the buzzing flies and knelt down to inspect the victim for any immediate identification. He noticed that the man had been shot multiple times in the torso with a small caliber firearm. The pockets of his trousers were turned inside out, and his wallet was missing from the scene entirely. Kalin stood up and looked at the endless stream of cars passing by on the busy interstate highway. He had a sinking feeling that this was not going to be a simple robbery gone wrong case. The precision of the shots and the concealment of the body suggested a cold and calculated level of violence. This was the beginning of a dark winter that would terrify the residents of the sunny southern state. The investigation moved slowly at first because there were no witnesses and very little forensic evidence to process. The humidity and the daily afternoon rains had washed away any tire tracks or footprints near the sedan. Kalen returned to the station and began the tedious work of running the license plate and vehicle registration. The car belonged to a shop owner who had been reported missing by his family 2 days prior. He was known to carry large amounts of cash and often picked up hitchhikers on his long drives. The detective pinned the photo of the victim on the bulletin board and started a new case file. 6 months passed without any major leads, and the case began to go cold in the filing cabinet. Then a second body was discovered in a wooded area in a neighboring county along the same highway. The victim was another middle-aged man who had been shot with a .22 caliber pistol. His car was found several miles away, and it had been wiped clean of any useful fingerprints. Kalen drove to the county morgue to compare the ballistics reports from the two seemingly unrelated crime scenes. The bullets recovered from both victims were a perfect match and proved they were killed by the same gun. The press began to pick up on the story and dubbed the unknown assailant the highway killer. Truck drivers and traveling salesmen were warned to be careful and not to pick up any strangers. The police profile suggested that the killer was likely a man who was drifting along the interstate system. They believed he was acting alone and using the victims for transportation and quick cash to survive. Kalen sat at his desk and stared at the map of the state marked with red pins. He felt that the profile was wrong because the victims were all large and capable men. It seemed unlikely that a single male attacker could surprise them without a struggle or signs of a fight. The break in the case finally came from a witness who saw a car veer off the road. A vehicle had crashed into a fence in a rural area, and 2 women were seen fleeing the scene. The witnesses described one woman as short and stocky with blonde hair and a very aggressive demeanor. The other woman was described as younger and more timid as she followed the blonde into the woods. The car they crashed belonged to a man who had been found dead just a few days earlier. Kalen received the call about the accident and immediately drove to the scene to supervise the forensic sweep. The interior of the crashed car was a goldmine of evidence that the killer had carelessly left behind. They found empty beer cans and receipts from various motels scattered across the floorboards of the vehicle. There was also a bloody fingerprint on the rearview mirror that the suspect had missed while wiping the car. The police lifted the print and sent it to the state lab for an expedited priority analysis. The results came back with a hit for a woman named Lee who had a long criminal record. She was a drifter who had been arrested multiple times for armed robbery and assault in other states. Kalen looked at the mugshot of the woman and recognized the cold stare in her dark eyes. She fit the description given by the witnesses at the crash site perfectly, and she was in the system. The detective now knew he was hunting a female serial killer, which was a rare and disturbing anomaly. He issued an all-points bulletin for Lee and her suspected female accomplice, who was likely her partner. The police checked the motel receipts found in the car and traced their path across the state. They were moving north and staying in cheap roadside motels under a variety of fake aliases. The investigation led them to a pawn shop where Lee had sold a radar detector and a camera. The items belonged to one of the missing men and linked her directly to the robbery and murder. The pawnbroker remembered the woman clearly because she had argued loudly about the price of the items. He provided the police with a thumbprint she had placed on the receipt as required by state law. Kalen held the receipt in his gloved hand and knew he finally had the physical evidence he needed. The thumbprint on the receipt was a perfect match to the bloody print found in the crashed car. The police tracked Lee to a biker bar in Volusia County, known as the Last Resort. It was a rough place where people went to disappear and avoid the prying eyes of the law. A team of undercover officers moved into the bar and spotted her drinking heavily at a back table. She was laughing loudly and seemed completely unaware that the net was closing in around her that night. Kalen gave the signal and the officers moved in to make the arrest without a single shot fired. Lee screamed and cursed at the officers as they dragged her out of the bar in handcuffs. She was brought to the interrogation room where the disturbing files of the investigation would truly be opened. Kalen sat across from her and placed the photos of the 7 victims on the metal table. Lee looked at the photos with no emotion and simply asked for a cigarette and a fresh coffee. She denied everything at first and claimed she was just a hitchhiker who got lucky with rides. The detective knew he needed a confession to ensure a conviction because the physical evidence was circumstantial. He decided to use her partner Tyra as leverage to get her to break her silence. Tyra had been found at a separate location and was cooperating fully with the police investigation team. The police told Lee that they were going to charge Tyra as an accomplice to the murders. This news caused Lee to snap, and her demeanor changed from defiant to protective in an instant. She looked directly into the camera lens that was recording the interrogation and began to speak. She told the detectives that she would confess to everything if they promised to let Tyra go free. Kaylin agreed to the deal and pressed the record button on the video camera to capture the statement. This was the moment where she killed her victims all over again on camera for the world to see. She described each murder in graphic detail and reenacted the moments leading up to the fatal shots. She claimed that every single one of the men had tried to assault her after picking her up. She said she killed them in self-defense and that she was the victim in the situation. Her voice was raspy, and her eyes were wide and manic as she told her side of the story. The camera captured every twitch and every shift in her tone as she relived the violent events. The public was horrified and fascinated by the footage of the woman who killed 7 men. The tapes were played on the news, and she became an instant celebrity in the darkest possible way. Kaylin watched the tapes over and over again, trying to find the truth in her rambling confession. He noticed that her story changed slightly every time she told it to a different person. Sometimes she was the victim, and other times she was a cold-blooded predator hunting for cash. The files grew thicker with each interview and each letter she wrote from her prison cell. The trial was a media circus that drew reporters from all over the world to the courthouse. Lee arrived each day wearing a different outfit and smiling for the cameras that lined the hallway. She seemed to enjoy the attention and used the platform to rant about the justice system. The jury watched the videotaped confession and saw the lack of remorse in her eyes on the screen. The prosecutor argued that she lured the men into the woods to rob them and kill them. The defense tried to paint her as a damaged woman who was fighting back against a lifetime of abuse. Kaylin took the stand and testified about the evidence found in the car and the pawn shop. He described the cold efficiency of the killings and the way the bodies were hidden in the brush. The jury deliberated for a short time before returning with a guilty verdict on all counts. Lee stood up and shouted at the jury, calling them corrupt and wishing them all a painful death. The judge sentenced her to death for the murders of the 7 men along the Florida highways. She was sent to death row, where she would spend the next decade waiting for her execution. During her time in prison, she continued to grant interviews to documentarians and news reporters. The files of Aileen Wuornos continued to grow even as she sat in a small isolation cell. She told wild stories about conspiracies and police corruption that made no sense to anyone who listened. Her mental state seemed to deteriorate rapidly as the date of her execution drew closer. She claimed that the camera was her only friend and the only way to get her truth out. The footage from these later years showed a woman who was completely detached from reality. Kaylin retired from the police force, but he never forgot the look in her eyes on the tape. He kept a copy of the case file in his study as a reminder of the evil he had seen. The case changed the way police investigated serial killers and highlighted the dangers of the open road. The myth of the safe hitchhiker was destroyed forever by the woman with the .22 caliber pistol. The families of the victims finally got closure when the state carried out the sentence in 2002. Lee's final words were as erratic and strange as her life had been leading up to that moment. The true tragedy of the story was the trail of destruction she left behind in her wake. 7 men were dead, and their families were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. The disturbing files of the investigation revealed a life of hardship that spiraled into extreme violence. It was a story of a woman who fell through every crack in society until she hit the bottom. But it was also a story of cold-blooded murder committed for a few $100s and a car. The camera captured it all and preserved the horror for future generations to study and analyze. Kaylin often wondered if things could have been different if she had been caught after the first murder. He thought about the man in the gray sedan and how long he lay in the tall grass. The detective knew that he had done his best to stop her before she could kill again. The humid air of Florida still hung heavy over the highways where the crimes took place. The woods were silent now, but the memory of the violence remained in the soil. Drivers still glanced at the tree line, wondering what secrets were hidden in the deep sawgrass. The tapes of her confession remain some of the most chilling pieces of evidence in criminal history. They show a human being who has completely lost the ability to feel empathy for others. She spoke of killing as if it were a mundane task, like buying groceries or pumping gas. The disconnect between her words and her actions was what terrified the public the most. She was a mirror reflecting the darkest parts of human nature back at the world. The title of the monster stuck to her, but she was just a broken person with a gun. The legacy of the case serves as a warning about the unseen dangers that exist in the world. It reminds us that evil does not always look like a monster from a movie. Sometimes it looks like a stranded motorist waving for help on the side of a lonely road. The camera lens captures the surface, but the files reveal the terrifying depth of the human soul. Kalen closed the file one last time and placed it in a box in the attic. He walked out onto his porch and watched the sun set over the Florida landscape. The crickets began to chirp in the twilight, and the heat of the day began to fade. He took a deep breath of the cooling air and tried to push the memories away. The story was over, and justice had been served in the eyes of the law. But the images on the screen would never truly fade from his mind. They were burned there forever, like a scar that refused to heal. The woman who killed her victims on camera had left a mark that would never be erased. The highways continued to flow with traffic as people went about their daily lives. They drove past the spots where the bodies were found without ever knowing what happened there. The anonymity of the road was restored, and the secrets were buried once again. But in the archives of the police department, the tapes sat on a dusty shelf. They waited for the next detective or researcher to pull them down and hit play. The disturbing voice of Lee would fill the room once again and tell her terrible story. The investigation proved that technology and forensic science were powerful tools in solving crimes. The thumbprint and the ballistics were the keys that unlocked the mystery of the highway killings. But it was the camera that provided the window into the mind of the killer. It allowed the world to see the face of the person responsible for the terror. It turned a faceless predator into a human being with a name and a voice. And in the end, that was the most frightening part of the entire ordeal. The realization that a person could commit such acts and then talk about them so casually, it challenged the definition of sanity and forced society to look at its failures. The case of Eileen Wuornos will always be remembered as a tragedy of American life. It is a story of violence and madness that played out on the national stage. The files are closed, but the questions remain about how such a thing could happen. And the camera continues to watch, waiting for the next story to unfold. Detective Kalen knew that there would always be another case and another killer to catch, but he hoped that he would never again see anything like the files of Lee. He went inside his house and locked the door behind him for the night. The safety of his home felt fragile after spending so much time in the darkness. He sat down in his chair and listened to the silence of the empty room. It was a peaceful sound compared to the noise of the interrogation room. He closed his eyes and finally let himself rest. Do you believe in other dimensions? 4 friends entered an abandoned school in North Jersey and experienced things science can't explain. What they found there will change how you see the world forever. On a star-filled night in North Jersey, 4 friends, myself, Yuri, Frank, and Freddie, decided to embark on an adventure that would forever change us. Our destination was an abandoned high school, a place left behind by time and forgotten by the world. It stood as a relic of the past, its windows shattered, its halls silent, yet calling out to those daring enough to explore it. We approached this journey with youthful enthusiasm, armed only with cans of spray paint to leave our mark through graffiti art and fireworks to light up the darkness. To us, it seemed like just another thrill-seeking escapade, a way to break free from the monotony of everyday life. But little did we know, this seemingly ordinary night would unravel mysteries far beyond our imagination. As we gathered near the entrance, excitement buzzed through the air. Freddie cracked jokes about how we'd become legends for exploring such a forbidden place, while Yuri whispered stories she had heard about strange occurrences happening there. Frank, ever the pragmatist, reminded us all to stay safe. though his words carried a hint of unease beneath their surface confidence. I felt a mix of anticipation and nervousness bubbling inside me, but at that moment, nothing could have prepared us for what awaited within the walls of that forsaken building. With each step forward, the reality of our decision began to sink in, setting the stage for something extraordinary or perhaps terrifying to unfold. The initial moments were filled with awe as we wandered through the corridors. Dust clung to every surface, creating ghostly patterns under the faint glow of our flashlight beams. Graffiti-covered lockers whispered secrets of long-departed students, and remnants of old desks sat like sentinels guarding memories of a bygone era. For a brief moment, it felt almost poetic, stepping into a piece of history untouched by modernity. Yet, even then, there was an underlying tension, a quiet whisper in the shadows urging caution. Still, we pressed on, determined to carve out our own story amidst the ruins of someone else's. Our laughter echoed through the empty hallways as Freddie attempted to recreate iconic movie scenes using only his voice and makeshift props. Yuri joined in, her giggles ringing out like music in the otherwise oppressive silence. Meanwhile, Frank carefully documented everything with his phone camera, ensuring no detail went unnoticed. Even I found myself caught up in the camaraderie, momentarily forgetting any lingering doubts. It was during one of these light-hearted interludes that the first inkling of foreboding crept in, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that none of us dared acknowledge aloud. And yet, deep down, we all knew something was amiss. Finally, after hours of wandering and tagging various spots with our artistic signatures, we decided to take a short break before heading back home. Sitting together in a corner of what once might have been a classroom, we shared snacks and recounted tales of other adventures we'd embarked upon. There was a sense of unity among us, a bond forged not just by proximity, but by mutual trust and respect. In that fleeting instant, surrounded by decay and ruin, we felt invincible, as if nothing could ever tear us apart or disturb the harmony of our friendship. But as fate would soon reveal, innocence has a way of crumbling when faced with the unknown. Stepping deeper into the labyrinthine structure of the abandoned school, the atmosphere grew increasingly unsettling. The high ceilings loomed above us, casting elongated shadows that danced eerily in the dim light of our flashlights. Layers of dust coated every surface, muffling our footsteps and adding an ethereal quality to the environment. At first, the remnants of student life, graffitied lockers, broken chairs, and scattered textbooks provided a nostalgic charm, almost romanticizing the neglect. However, as we ventured further, the ambiance shifted dramatically. It started subtly, a chill running down my spine despite the warmth of the summer night outside. Then came the faint scent of sulfur, barely noticeable but unmistakable once identified. My heart quickened as I turned to share the observation with the others, only to find them equally affected, their faces pale and eyes wide with apprehension. "Do you smell that?" Yuri asked softly, her voice trembling slightly. No one needed to confirm. The answer hung heavy in the air between us. Our exploration led us to a particularly desolate corridor where the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. It was here that we stumbled upon the first anomaly, a pentagram etched onto the wall, stark white against the grimy brick background. The sight froze us in place, disbelief warring with dread. The edges of the symbol appeared fresh, as though it had been drawn mere hours ago. How was this possible? Who would dare perform such rituals in a place so isolated and forgotten? Questions swirled in our minds, unanswered and unanswerable. Frank, ever the skeptic, tried to rationalize the discovery. "Maybe it's just some prank," he suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. Freddie nodded along, attempting to lighten the mood with a joke, but the humor fell flat. Even Yuri, usually the most level-headed among us, couldn't hide her discomfort. The longer we stared at the ominous marking, the more it seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, drawing our gaze unwillingly. Reluctantly, we tore ourselves away, vowing silently never to speak of what we'd seen, but deep down, we all knew it was too late for denial. The weight of the moment settled heavily on our shoulders as we continued onward, each step now accompanied by heightened awareness. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind through broken windows sent shivers coursing through our bodies. What had begun as a carefree expedition was rapidly transforming into something darker, something that tested the limits of our courage and understanding. And still, we moved forward, driven by curiosity and fear in equal measure, unaware of the horrors yet to come. Despite the growing unease, we pushed ahead, clinging to the hope that familiarity would restore a semblance of normalcy. Each room we explored brought new surprises, some amusing, others disconcerting, but nothing prepared us for the sudden realization that struck Frank. "Guys, my bag is gone," he muttered, his voice tinged with panic. His backpack, which had been slung carelessly over a chair moments earlier, had vanished without a trace. At first, we dismissed it as a simple oversight. Perhaps he had set it down somewhere else in the room, or maybe it had slipped off the chair unnoticed. But as we retraced our steps, calling out for it amidst the echoes of our voices, the absurdity of the situation became undeniable. How could a physical object simply disappear in such a confined space? Panic rippled through the group, feeding off the already tense atmosphere. We split up briefly, combing the area methodically. Yuri checked beneath desks. Freddie searched corners obscured by debris, while Frank and I examined the doorways leading to adjacent rooms. Minutes stretched into eternity, the silence broken only by our ragged breathing and murmured reassurances. Just as despair began to creep in, Freddie shouted from across the room, "Over here!" Rushing to his side, we found the missing bag not where we had last seen it, but tucked neatly inside a previously unexamined closet. Stranger still, the bag rested atop a freshly painted pentagram, its colors vivid and wet to the touch. The implications were staggering. Not only had someone or something moved Frank's belongings, but they had done so deliberately, leaving behind evidence of their presence. Shock rooted us to the spot, rendering coherent thought nearly impossible. Yuri clasped her hands over her mouth, tears welling up in her eyes. Freddie, typically brash and fearless, looked pale and shaken. Even Frank, whose calm demeanor often steadied the group, struggled to maintain composure. This wasn't just mischief anymore. This was deliberate manipulation, a clear message that we weren't alone, and whoever or whatever lurked in the shadows meant business. Fear coiled tightly around our hearts, threatening to suffocate us. Yet, amidst the chaos, a glimmer of determination sparked within us. If someone or something was playing games with us, we wouldn't back down without answers. Clutching our belongings tighter, we resolved to press on, though the path ahead promised only uncertainty and danger. Reunited and fortified by shared resolve, we resumed our trek through the eerie confines of the school. Tensions remained high, every shadow and sound magnified tenfold by our heightened senses. It was during this phase of our journey that Yuri and Freddie stumbled upon a scene so bizarre it defied explanation. They had wandered slightly ahead of the group, drawn by a faint humming noise emanating from a distant corner. Following the sound, they entered a classroom unlike any other they'd encountered thus far. Its interior bore signs of recent activity chairs arranged in a circle, candles flickering despite the lack of visible flame, and three figures cloaked in black robes seated silently within the formation. Their heads bowed low, obscuring their features, yet their presence radiated an aura of authority and mystery. Yuri and Freddie watched in stunned silence as the robed figures engaged in an unusual ritual involving marbles. They rolled the glass spheres across the floor in intricate patterns, their movements synchronized and deliberate. Though the action seemed innocent enough, the sheer intensity of focus exuded by the strangers made it anything but mundane. When one of the marbles came dangerously close to Yuri's foot, she gasped audibly, alerting the figures to her presence. Slowly, deliberately, the trio raised their heads, revealing hollow eyes devoid of pupils. Their gazes pierced through the darkness, locking on to Yuri and Freddie with unnerving precision. Neither of us could move, paralyzed by the overwhelming sensation of being scrutinized, judged, and found wanting. Finally, Freddie summoned the courage to ask, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" The response came not in words, but in actions. One figure extended a hand, palm upward, inviting or commanding the two to join the circle. Instinctively, Yuri grabbed Freddie's arm and pulled him backward, breaking the spell-like hold the encounter had cast over them. As they retreated, the hum of the marbles intensified, reverberating through the walls like a warning. By the time they rejoined Frank and me, their faces were pale, their voices shaky as they recounted the harrowing experience. This revelation added another layer of complexity to our predicament. Were these individuals guardians of the school, protectors of secrets best left undisturbed? Or were they malevolent entities seeking to ensnare intruders in their twisted games? The questions piled higher, each more daunting than the last, leaving us teetering on the brink of comprehension and despair. Moments after hearing Yuri and Freddy's chilling account, the air around us shifted again, this time carrying with it a tangible sense of menace. From somewhere deep within the building, a rhythmic pounding began, footsteps resonating against the wooden floors, deliberate and measured. Each thud reverberated through our chests, amplifying the dread pooling in our stomachs. Initially, we assumed it was merely an echo caused by the peculiar acoustics of the abandoned structure, but as the sounds grew louder, closer, the illusion crumbled. These weren't random footsteps. They followed a pattern, advancing steadily toward our location. Worse still, they carried an unnatural weight, as though belonging to something far larger or more sinister than human. Frank instinctively reached for his phone, attempting to record the phenomenon, but the screen flickered and died, drained of power despite having been fully charged moments earlier. Panic surged anew, unchecked and raw. We huddled together, backs pressed against a crumbling wall, hearts pounding in unison with the approaching steps. The sound grew deafening, each beat a reminder of our vulnerability. Then, a voice cut through the cacophony, a low, gravelly growl that sent shivers coursing through our spines. "You shouldn't be here," it intoned, the words dripping with malice and intent. Though spoken from a distance, the voice seemed to surround us, invading our minds and stripping away any pretense of bravery. Tears streamed down Yuri's face as she buried her head in Freddy's shoulder, while Frank clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, suspended in the balance between fight and flight. Then, spurred by primal instinct, we bolted, abandoning all pretense of dignity in favor of survival. Doors slammed shut behind us, corridors twisted impossibly, and yet we ran, driven by the promise of escape and the desperate hope that whatever pursued us would tire of the chase. But even as we fled, the memory of those haunting footsteps lingered, a constant reminder of the terrors hidden within the walls of that forsaken school. The moment the voice echoed through the halls, our instincts kicked into overdrive. Without a word exchanged, we bolted like startled deer, each of us driven by primal fear and the desperate need to survive. The once familiar corridors now felt alien, every corner a potential ambush point, every shadow concealing an unseen threat. Our footsteps thundered against the wooden floors, reverberating through the vast emptiness of the school, amplifying our panic. Frank led the charge, his phone long dead but still clutched tightly in his hand as if it might somehow offer protection. Yuri followed close behind, her breaths shallow and ragged, tears streaming down her face despite her attempts to remain composed. Freddy brought up the rear, glancing over his shoulder repeatedly, half expecting the robed figures or whatever had been pursuing us to materialize at any second. I ran alongside them, my lungs burning with exertion, my mind racing with fragmented thoughts. Would we make it out alive? What would happen if we didn't? Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on us like an invisible force. We navigated through labyrinthine hallways that seemed to twist and turn unnaturally, defying logic and memory. Tangayang earlier appeared stable, now groaned beneath our feet, threatening to collapse under the urgency of our retreat. Dust swirled around us, creating ghostly patterns in the dim light of our flashlights, which flickered erratically as if sensing the chaos enveloping us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we stumbled upon the exit, a rusted metal door partially hidden behind layers of vines and debris. It was locked, of course, but Frank's frantic hands worked quickly, fumbling with the mechanism until it gave way with a loud creak. Bursting through the doorway, we spilled onto the cool night air, gasping for breath as though we'd just resurfaced from drowning. The wind kissed our faces, carrying with it the promise of freedom, yet none of us could shake the lingering dread that clung to us like a second skin. For all the relief of making it outside, the question remained, Had we truly escaped or merely postponed the inevitable? Collapsing onto the damp grass surrounding the school, we sat huddled together, clutching one another's hands as if afraid to let go. Breathing heavily, we tried to steady our erratic heartbeats, though the pounding in our chests refused to subside. Silence reigned supreme, broken only by the occasional sniffle or shaky exhalation. Each of us processed the events of the night in our own way, some staring blankly into the distance, others burying their heads in their knees. Yuri was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "What were they?" she asked, directing the question not to anyone specific, but rather into the void between us. Her words hung heavy in the air, unanswerable yet demanding attention. Freddie shook his head, unable or unwilling to provide an explanation. Frank simply stared at the ground, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. As minutes stretched into what felt like hours, I found myself reflecting on the courage it took to press forward despite overwhelming fear. Each of us had faced moments where retreat seemed the only viable option, yet we chose instead to confront the unknown. That decision, reckless though it may have been, bonded us in ways words never could. Even now, sitting amidst the remnants of our terror, there was an undeniable sense of camaraderie, a shared understanding that we had survived something extraordinary together. But even as the adrenaline began to wane, replaced slowly by exhaustion, questions lingered in my mind. Who or what had we encountered inside those walls? Were the robed figures mere humans performing rituals, or did they belong to something far beyond human comprehension? And more importantly, why had they allowed us to leave? These thoughts gnawed at me, refusing to be silenced, and I knew then that this experience would haunt me for years to come. In the days following our harrowing escape, life attempted to return to normal, but nothing about us was quite the same anymore. The four of us grew quieter, more introspective, often lost in thought during moments when laughter or chatter would normally fill the silence. Yet, despite our collective unease, word of our adventure spread like wildfire among friends and acquaintances. At first, we dismissed inquiries with vague responses, reluctant to delve into details that seemed too surreal to share. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and soon enough, fragments of our story leaked out, twisting and morphing as they passed from person to person. Some listeners dismissed our tale outright, chalking it up to youthful exaggeration or late-night drunken ramblings. Others, however, latched onto the narrative with fervor, weaving elaborate theories about the abandoned school being a gateway to other dimensions or a hotspot for supernatural activity. Urban legends sprouted overnight, fueling speculation and drawing attention to a place most people had forgotten existed. Social media platforms buzzed with posts and comments debating the veracity of our claims, turning what started as a personal nightmare into public fascination. For us, though, the reality remained raw and unfiltered. No amount of skepticism or disbelief could diminish the truth of what we experienced. The pentagrams, the robed figures, the haunting footsteps, all of it replayed vividly in our minds whenever silence fell. While some chose to mock or doubt, we carried the burden of knowing firsthand that some mysteries are best left undisturbed. And yet, paradoxically, sharing snippets of our ordeal offered a strange sort of catharsis, allowing us to process the incomprehensible one piece at a time. Time marched onward, bringing with it new challenges and distractions, yet the events of that fateful night refused to fade completely. Months turned into years, and while life moved forward, certain questions continued to plague my thoughts, surfacing unexpectedly during quiet moments or restless nights. Why had the robed figures chosen to perform their rituals in such an isolated location? Were they protecting something sacred, or guarding secrets too dangerous to reveal? And perhaps most unsettling of all, why had they let us go? These queries haunted me like ghosts, refusing to be laid to rest. Conversations with Yuri, Frank, and Freddie occasionally revisited the topic, though no answers emerged that satisfied any of us. Freddie suggested they might have been testing us, gauging whether we posed a genuine threat to their activities. Yuri proposed the possibility that we had unknowingly interrupted something critical, prompting them to temporarily halt their operations. Meanwhile, Frank leaned toward the theory that their motives were purely ritualistic, unrelated to anything involving outsiders. None of these explanations fully accounted for the eerie precision with which they manipulated our movements. The reappearance of his bag atop the freshly painted pentagram, the deliberate placement of marbles in their circular formation, the chilling warning delivered through the disembodied voice, every detail pointed to intentionality, suggesting a level of control that made me deeply uncomfortable. And though years have passed since that night, the absence of definitive answers leaves a void in my mind, one that grows larger with each passing day. To this day, the abandoned high school stands as both a physical reminder and a psychological scar etched into our memories. Though none of us has dared to return, its presence looms large in our lives, shaping decisions and influencing perspectives in subtle yet profound ways. For some, the allure of the unknown draws them closer, compelling them to seek answers where none exist. For others, including ourselves, the mystery serves as a cautionary tale, a testament to the dangers lurking in places untouched by modernity. Our journey through those crumbling halls taught us many things: the fragility of courage, the power of friendship, and the limits of human understanding. Yet perhaps the most significant lesson lies in the realization that some questions are meant to remain unanswered. To pursue clarity in matters shrouded in darkness risks inviting forces beyond comprehension into your life. This truth weighs heavily on my shoulders, urging caution even as curiosity tugs persistently at the edges of my mind. If you've ever heard whispers about that school or stumbled across similar stories elsewhere, I implore you to tread carefully. Some mysteries are better left buried, their secrets guarded by time and shadow. As for me, I carry the memory of that night not as a burden, but as a reminder, a constant nagging question mark that keeps me awake at night, wondering what truly transpired within those walls. The creepy phone number that always answers when you call at 3 a.m. The legend of the cursed telephone number had circulated on the darker corners of the internet for nearly 10 years. It started as a rumor on a message board dedicated to technology glitches and old analog phone systems. Users claimed that a specific number with a local area code would always answer if dialed at 3 in the morning. The terrifying part of the story was not just that it answered, but that it allegedly played back your own voice. The number was said to be a deadline that had been disconnected by the phone company decades ago. However, curiosity is a powerful force, and many people tried to call the number despite the ominous warnings online. Our story focuses on a skeptical freelance journalist named Marcus, who lived in a rainy city in the Pacific Northwest. The year was 2016, and Marcus was writing a feature article about the persistence of modern urban legends. He wanted to debunk the myth of the phantom number and prove that it was simply a disconnected line recording. He spent weeks researching the origins of the number and tracing it back to a defunct telecommunications company. The company had gone bankrupt in the late 90s, and its infrastructure had been absorbed by larger corporations over the years. Marcus believed the number was likely an automated test loop that had been forgotten by the engineers during the transition. He decided to conduct the experiment himself on a stormy Tuesday night in late October to set the proper mood. He set up his recording equipment in his small home office to capture high-quality audio of the call. He wanted to document every second of the experience to share with his readers, and finally put the rumor to rest. He waited until the digital clock on his computer screen read exactly 3 o'clock in the morning before he dialed. His hand shook slightly as he pressed the green call button on his smartphone and held it to his ear. The silence in the room was heavy, and the sound of the rain against the window seemed to grow louder. The phone rang once with a strange and hollow tone that sounded different from a standard modern digital ringback tone. It rang a second time, and then the line clicked open with a sharp sound of static and mechanical interference. Marcus held his breath and waited for a voice or a recording to play on the other end of the line. For the first 10 seconds, there was nothing but a low hum that sounded like wind blowing through a tunnel. He checked his recording software to make sure the levels were moving and confirmed that the audio was being captured. He cleared his throat and asked if anyone was there in a clear and steady voice that masked his fear. The line remained silent for another long moment before a series of strange clicking sounds echoed through the speaker. Then a voice cut through the static. and repeated the exact phrase Marcus had just said a moment earlier. The voice was distorted and sounded metallic, but it was unmistakably his own voice asking if anyone was there. Marcus felt a cold chill run down his spine as he realized the legend was technically true so far. He assumed it was a simple audio feedback loop that echoed the audio back to the caller with a delay. He decided to test the theory by saying a random string of numbers to see if they were repeated back. He recited the numbers 1 through 5 and waited for the echo to return them to him through the phone. The voice on the other end repeated the numbers, but the tone was different and sounded angry or impatient. The playback was not a simple echo because the inflection of the voice did not match what Marcus had just said. It sounded like clips of his voice had been spliced together from different conversations to form the new sentence. He immediately hung up the phone and sat back in his chair with his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to rationalize what he had just heard by telling himself it was a sophisticated prank or a hack. He began to review the audio file he had just recorded on his computer to analyze the strange metallic voice. He put on his noise-canceling headphones and turned the volume up to hear the background noise in the recording. He could hear faint sounds behind the static that sounded like heavy machinery or perhaps a large ventilation fan. There was also a rhythmic thumping sound that resembled footsteps walking on a metal grate or a concrete floor. He realized that the call had connected to a physical location where a microphone was picking up the ambient environment. This meant the number was not a digital ghost, but a real line connected to a real place somewhere. Marcus decided to try and trace the location of the line using his contacts in the local telecom industry. He called an old friend named David who worked as a senior network engineer for a major service provider. David was reluctant to help at first because accessing customer records without a warrant was strictly against company policy. Marcus convinced him that this was a matter of public safety and potentially involved an illegal wiretapping operation. David agreed to run a trace on the number to see which physical switch it was routed through in the city. The process took several hours, and Marcus spent the time pacing around his apartment and checking his locks. The phone on his desk rang just as the sun was starting to rise over the gray city skyline. He picked it up, expecting it to be David with the results of the trace he had requested earlier. Instead, he heard the same low hum and static that he had heard on the mysterious call at 3. He looked at the caller ID and saw that the number calling him was his own cell phone number. This is a common technique used by scammers called spoofing, but in this context, it felt personal and threatening. A voice on the line spoke his name clearly and then played a recording of him sleeping in his bed. The recording captured the sound of his breathing and the rustling of his sheets from the previous night. Marcus dropped the phone in horror as he realized the surveillance was not just happening over the phone lines. Someone had been inside his apartment or had placed a listening device in his bedroom to capture that audio. He immediately began to tear his bedroom apart, looking for a bug or a hidden microphone in the walls. He checked the vents and the smoke detectors and behind the headboard of his bed, but found nothing. The fear turned into anger, and he grabbed his keys to drive to the address David had just sent. David texted him a location in the industrial district near the old shipping yards by the river. The address corresponded to a brick building that had once served as a switching station for the telephone company. The building was supposed to be abandoned and slated for demolition to make room for new luxury condos. Marcus drove through the morning traffic with a sense of urgency that made him run 2 red lights. He arrived at the desolate street and parked his car a block away to avoid being seen by anyone. The building was covered in graffiti, and the windows were boarded up with sheets of plywood and metal bars. He approached the rear entrance and found that the heavy steel door had been pried open slightly at the bottom. He squeezed through the gap and entered a dark hallway that smelled of mold and old copper wiring. He used the flashlight on his phone to navigate the maze of corridors that were filled with debris. The silence of the building was broken by the familiar low hum that he had heard on the phone call. He followed the sound toward the center of the building where the main server room was located. The room was massive and filled with rows of dusty server racks and old analog switching equipment. Most of the equipment was dead and dark, but one rack in the corner was still blinking with green lights. A thick bundle of cables ran from the rack to a makeshift desk that had been set up nearby. The desk was covered in monitors and audio equipment that looked like it had been scavenged from a dumpster. Marcus approached the desk slowly and saw that the screens were displaying live feeds from hundreds of cameras. He saw the interior of strangers' living rooms and bedrooms and offices displayed in black and white grids. He realized that this was not just about a phone number, but a massive illegal surveillance hub. The hum grew louder as he realized it was coming from a cooling fan that had been rigged to the equipment. He saw a logbook on the desk that contained lists of phone numbers and names and addresses. He flipped through the pages and saw his own name written in a shaky hand near the bottom of the list. The dates next to his name went back several months, which meant he had been watched for a long time. He pulled out his phone to take pictures of the evidence so he could bring it to the police. Just as he snapped the first photo, he heard the sound of footsteps on the metal grate above him. He looked up and saw a shadow moving along the catwalk that ran around the perimeter of the room. A man was standing there looking down at him with a pair of heavy industrial headphones around his neck. The man looked disheveled and wild with a long beard and clothes that were stained with grease and dirt. He did not yell or try to run, but simply stared at Marcus with a look of intense curiosity. Marcus shouted that he had called the police and that they were on their way to the building. The man laughed, a dry and raspy laugh that sounded exactly like the static on the phone line. The stranger spoke, and his voice was the metallic and distorted voice that Marcus had heard on the call. He was using a voice modulator device that he held to his throat to mask his real voice. He told Marcus that the police could not stop the collection because the data was already in the cloud. He claimed that he was archiving the lives of the city to preserve them before they were forgotten by history. He believed he was doing a public service by recording the private moments of the citizens of the city. Marcus realized he was dealing with a deeply delusional individual who had lost touch with reality completely. Marcus turned and ran back toward the hallway he had entered from, while the man watched him from above. He scrambled through the debris and squeezed back out through the gap in the heavy steel door. He ran to his car and locked the doors before dialing the emergency number to summon the police. He waited in his car until the patrol cars arrived with their sirens wailing and their lights flashing. He directed the officers to the entrance and told them about the surveillance center and the man inside. The police entered the building with their weapons drawn and began a floor-by-floor search of the premises. They found the server room and the equipment just as Marcus had described it to them in the parking lot. However, the man on the catwalk was gone, and there was no sign of where he had escaped. The police found a hidden hatch on the roof that led to the fire escape on the neighboring building. The suspect had vanished into the city, leaving behind terabytes of stolen data and recordings of thousands of people. The police seized the equipment and began the long process of notifying the victims of the privacy breach. Marcus wrote his article, but it was not the debunking piece he had originally planned to write. The story became a national scandal and led to a complete audit of the city's old infrastructure. Utility companies were forced to secure their abandoned buildings and disconnect all inactive legacy lines. The mystery of the phone number was solved, but the identity of the man remained unknown to the public. The police identified him tentatively as a former technician who had been fired for stalking years ago. He had used his knowledge of the system to build his own private kingdom in the forgotten station. He lived in the walls of the city and fed on the secrets of the people living there. The twist in the story came a few months later, when Marcus had moved to a new apartment. He had changed his phone number and his email address and tried to start a fresh life. He was unpacking boxes in his new living room when his landline phone began to ring. He had not given the number to anyone yet except for the utility company and his parents. He stared at the phone for a long time before he finally picked up the receiver to answer. He expected to hear a telemarketer or a wrong number on the other end of the line. Instead, he heard the familiar low hum of the ventilation fan and the rhythmic thumping of footsteps. The metallic voice whispered a series of numbers that corresponded to his new address and zip code. The caller knew exactly where he was and had found him despite all his precautions to hide. Marcus realized that the man had not just tapped the physical lines, but had compromised the database itself. As long as Marcus was connected to the grid, the man would always be able to find him. He hung up the phone and pulled the cord out of the wall with a violent jerk. The button of the story is the realization that true privacy is an illusion in the modern world. Marcus lives a mostly analog life now and avoids smart devices and unnecessary digital connections. He still works as a writer, but he uses a typewriter and submits his drafts by mail or courier. He knows that somewhere out there in the dark, the archivist is still listening and recording. The city is full of dead lines and abandoned wires that can be used by those who know how. And every time the phone rings late at night, he feels a cold shiver of fear return. The legend of the number at 3 a.m. faded from the internet as new rumors took its place. But for the people who were recorded, the fear never truly went away or faded with time. They wonder if their secrets are sitting on a hard drive somewhere, waiting to be listened to again. The voice in the static is a reminder that someone is always watching, even when we think we are alone. The phone network is a vast web that connects us all, but also traps us in its reach. And sometimes the voice on the other end is not a ghost, but something much more human. The police case remains open but inactive, as no new leads have surfaced in the years since. The abandoned building was eventually demolished, and a shiny glass tower was built in its place. The residents of the new condos have no idea what used to exist in the space below their feet. They sleep soundly in their beds, surrounded by their smart speakers and their connected cameras. They do not hear the phantom ring or the static that sometimes bleeds through the lines. But deep in the city, the signal still travels through the copper veins of the old world. Marcus often walks by the site and looks up at the new building with a heavy heart. He wonders if the man is still out there finding new ways to listen to the world. The technology changes, but the desire to watch and to know remains a constant human flaw. The experience taught him that curiosity can open doors that are better left closed and locked tight. He never dials random numbers anymore, and he advises his readers to do the same. The risk of who might answer is simply too high to take for a moment of thrill. The story serves as a warning to those who seek out the strange and the unknown online. The barrier between the digital legend and the physical reality is thinner than we think. A simple phone call can bridge the gap and bring the horror into your own home. The darkness is not just in the supernatural, but in the obsessed minds of people living on the fringe. So if your phone rings at 3 a.m., it is best to let it go to voicemail, because you never know who is holding the receiver on the other end of the line. In this news story, the winter of 2014 was recorded as one of the most brutal seasons in the history of the Midwest. A massive polar vortex had descended upon the region and turned the landscape into a frozen wasteland of ice. The snow fell in sheets that were so thick they blotted out the streetlights and the moon completely. The temperature dropped to levels that were dangerous for anyone caught outside for more than a few minutes. The local authorities advised everyone to stay off the roads and to remain indoors until the storm passed. But life does not always stop for the weather, and some people had to brave the elements that night. Caleb was a 35-year-old architect who prided himself on his punctuality and his unwavering reliability to his family. He was driving his reliable sedan down a country road that he had traveled 1,000 times before. The road connected his office in the city to the quiet suburb where he lived with his wife. He had left work early to beat the storm, but the weather moved faster than the forecasters predicted. The snow began to accumulate on the windshield faster than his wipers could clear it away from the glass. The black asphalt of the road disappeared under a layer of white powder that hid the lane markers. He gripped the steering wheel with both hands and leaned forward to see through the swirling vortex of snow. The heater in his car was blasting hot air, but the cold managed to seep through the glass. He reached for his phone, which was mounted on the dashboard, to send a quick update to his wife. He used the voice command feature to dictate a message so he could keep his hands on the wheel. The text message was sent at exactly 6 o'clock in the evening to his wife waiting at home. It consisted of 2 simple words that would haunt her forever, and those words were almost home. His wife, named Sarah, received the message and felt a wave of relief wash over her anxious mind. She was in the kitchen preparing a warm dinner and listening to the wind howl against the windows. She replied with a heart emoji and told him to drive safely and to watch out for ice. She set the table and waited for the sound of his car pulling into the driveway as usual. The minutes ticked by and turned into an hour without any sign of headlights cutting through the darkness. She checked her phone again and saw that her last message to him had not been delivered yet. She tried to call him, but the call went straight to voicemail without ringing even a single time. The panic began to set in as she realized that his commute should have only taken 30 minutes. She paced the living room floor and looked out the front window every time a car passed by. She called his office, but the security guard told her that everyone had left the building hours ago. She called the local police department, but the lines were jammed with reports of accidents and stranded motorists. She finally got through to a dispatcher who told her to stay calm and wait for an update. The storm raged on through the night and dumped nearly 2 feet of snow on the sleeping town. Sarah did not sleep at all, but sat by the window watching the snow pile up outside. The sun rose the next morning and revealed a world that was buried in a blanket of white. The roads were impassable and the schools and businesses were closed due to the state of emergency declared. A sheriff deputy finally made it to her house in a large four-wheel drive vehicle that morning. He told her that they had found Caleb's car abandoned on the side of the road 3 miles away. Sarah felt a surge of hope because finding the car meant that he might have walked to a house. She asked the deputy if they had checked the nearby homes or if he was at the hospital. The deputy looked grim and told her that the car was empty and the engine was cold. There were no footprints around the vehicle because the heavy snow had filled them in during the night. The car was parked neatly on the shoulder as if he had pulled over to check something. The keys were gone, but his wallet and his laptop bag were still sitting on the passenger seat. The search and rescue team was assembled quickly despite the difficult conditions and the freezing temperatures of the day. They brought in tracking dogs that were trained to find people buried in the snow or lost in woods. The dogs sniffed the car seat to get Caleb's scent and immediately ran toward the dense forest nearby. The woods bordered a large frozen lake and a series of steep ravines that were dangerous in winter. The team followed the dogs into the tree line while fighting against the deep drifts of fresh powder. The wind had died down, but the air was still cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. They searched for hours but found no sign of the missing architect in the immediate vicinity of the car. The snow was so deep that probing poles were used to check every lump and drift on the ground. The team expanded their search grid to cover a 5-mile radius around the abandoned vehicle that day. They found a single glove lying near a frozen creek bed about a mile from the road. Sarah confirmed that the glove belonged to Caleb and was a gift she had given him for Christmas. This discovery renewed the urgency of the search because it meant he was definitely in the woods alone. The glove was found far away from any houses or roads, which confused the experienced search team members. Caleb was a smart man who knew the area well and should have walked toward the town lights. There was no logical reason for him to head deeper into the wilderness and toward the frozen lake. The sun began to set on the second day, and the temperature dropped again to dangerous lows. The search was called off for the night to protect the safety of the rescue volunteers and dogs. Sarah sat at home with her parents and tried to understand why her husband would walk into danger. The investigation into the disappearance looked at every possible angle, including foul play and a staged event. The police checked his bank accounts and his phone records for any sign of trouble or secret plans. They found nothing unusual and confirmed that he was a happy man with no enemies or debts. The car had plenty of gas and the battery was dead because the lights had been left on. The mechanical inspection showed that the car was in perfect working order and had not broken down. This deepened the mystery of why he pulled over and why he left the safety of the vehicle. The days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months without any new leads or evidence found. The snow continued to fall and bury the secrets of the forest under layer after layer of ice. The official search was suspended, but Sarah continued to hire private investigators to look for her missing husband. She refused to give up hope that he was still out there somewhere waiting to be found alive. She put up flyers in every town in the county and created a website to gather tips. But the phone never rang, and the tips that came in were all dead ends or hoaxes. The spring thaw finally arrived in April, and the snow began to melt away from the woods slowly. The landscape changed from white to brown as the mud and the dead leaves were revealed again. A group of teenagers were hiking near the lake when they spotted something bright blue in the brush. They walked over to investigate and found a heavy winter coat lying on the ground near a tree. The police were called, and they identified the coat as the one Caleb was wearing when he vanished. The coat was found nearly 4 miles from where the glove had been discovered months earlier. The police brought the cadaver dogs back to the woods to search the area around the coat thoroughly. The dogs led the officers to a small cave that was hidden behind a cluster of large rocks. The cave was shallow and offered very little protection from the wind or the cold of winter. Inside the cave, they found the skeletal remains of Caleb, still wearing his suit and his dress shoes. He was huddled in the back of the cave in a fetal position with his arms wrapped around himself. The medical examiner determined that he had died of hypothermia on the night of the storm. But the discovery of the body raised more questions than it answered for the investigators and the family. Why had he walked 5 miles in the wrong direction through deep snow and dangerous terrain that night? Why had he taken off his coat, which was his only defense against the freezing cold air? And why did he pull over his car in the first place when he was only 3 miles from home? The police found his cell phone in his pocket and sent it to a digital forensics lab for analysis. The phone was damaged by the moisture, but the technicians were able to retrieve the data from the memory. The data revealed a series of photos that Caleb had taken after he pulled over to the side. The first photo showed a small kitten sitting in the middle of the road in the snow. This explained why a kind-hearted man like Caleb would stop his car in a blizzard. He likely got out to move the kitten to safety, and the animal ran into the woods. He followed the kitten into the tree line, thinking he could catch it quickly and return to his car. But the storm disoriented him and covered his tracks within minutes of him entering the dense forest. The text "almost home" was sent just seconds before he saw the kitten and pulled over to help. The phone data showed that he tried to use his GPS map to find his way back. But the signal in the woods was weak, and the cold drained his battery faster than normal. He wandered in circles for hours as the hypothermia began to affect his judgment and his mind. The condition caused him to feel confused and warm, which explained why he removed his heavy coat. He likely thought he was walking toward the lights of his house, but was walking further away. The cave was his final attempt to find shelter when his body could no longer keep moving forward. He sat down to rest and fell into the deep sleep that comes before death in the cold. The tragedy was that he was trying to do a good deed, and it cost him his life. The kitten was never found and likely perished in the storm along with the man who tried to save it. Sarah wept when she saw the photo of the small animal that had lured her husband away. It was a heartbreaking image that showed the last thing he saw before the darkness took him. The button of the story is the fragile nature of the decisions we make in split seconds. A simple act of kindness turned into a nightmare because of the unforgiving power of the winter storm. Caleb was almost home and safe in his warm house with the family he loved so much. But fate intervened in the form of a lost animal and a whiteout that erased the world. The story serves as a reminder to stay in your vehicle during a storm, no matter what you see. The wilderness is waiting for a mistake, and it does not show mercy to those who enter unprepared. The spot on the road where he pulled over is now marked with a small wooden cross. People leave flowers and small toy cats there to honor the memory of the man who stopped. The woods behind the marker are quiet now, and the trees have grown over the path he took. But the locals still look at that patch of forest with a sense of sadness and respect. They know that a good man walked into those trees and never walked out again because he cared. It is a legacy of kindness that is mixed with the tragedy of a life cut short. Sarah eventually moved away from the house that held so many memories of waiting by the window. She could not bear to watch the snow fall on the driveway where his car should have been. She started a foundation in his name